In October of 1863, here in Bannack, Montana, there was an explosion of crime, mostly related to robberies of miners and the gold mining operations, but there was also murders. There's so much crime that a vigilance committee was formed, the Montana Vigilance Committee, a group of vigilantes. And by February of 1864, just about 5 months later, they had rounded up and executed 23 men without trial, including the town sheriff and 2 of his deputies. That sheriff, Henry Plummer, was only 31 years old, and he had moved from his home in Maine to the west in 1852, at the age of 19. He was considered an average-sized man, but had suffered from tuberculosis as a child. And the famous California gold rush had started just 4 years prior, and he went straight to San Francisco to participate. After saving some money and working as a clerk, he moved to Nevada City and gained a lot of success buying stakes in mines and operating small ranches. He opened a bakery, sold it for a profit. He then opened a saloon, sold that for a profit, and had become so established that in May of 1856, he ran for and won the election as city marshal of Nevada City. At the age of 24, he was now in charge of keeping order in a Wild West mining town where arguments were usually solved over either booze or bullets. And he was known to be an efficient and effective marshal. In a lot of ways, it hurt his popularity amongst some of the rougher crowd. This would come to light when he became involved in a long-standing domestic dispute between John and Lucy Vedder, residents of Nevada City. Lucy enlisted Plummer's help to leave John, and while packing to leave town, John came home and became enraged. John then shot at Plummer, and Plummer returned fire, killing him. Plummer was then arrested and was charged with second-degree murder, not self-defense. And this was reportedly because he took 2 steps towards John while he was shooting. Newspapers and the rumor mill also hinted heavily at a case of infidelity, and this potentially swayed the jury into a guilty verdict. The result for Henry Plummer was a 10-year sentence at San Quentin, the prison in San Francisco Bay. As soon as he arrived, though, his tuberculosis flared up so badly that within months, the prison doctor wrote to the governor of California for a pardon, assuming that Plummer was not going to survive much longer, and the governor approved it, supported by Plummer's record of civil service. Upon release, his health improved, but within about a year he was once again involved in an altercation and shooting. He killed the man and turned himself into the police. The deputies knew him, and they allowed him to leave custody, knowing that his past record would most likely condemn him. At this point he was broke and somewhat of an outlaw. He moved to Washington Territory, and once again, shot a man during an altercation. If he was anything, he was consistent. It's at this point he decides it's probably best to go back to Maine, and while waiting for a steamboat in Fort Benning, Montana, he was approached by a man named James Vail, who needed help protecting his family and land from Native Americans. Plummer agreed to take the job, along with an acquaintance of his, Jack Cleveland. Quickly, though, both men fell in love with James Vail's sister-in-law, a woman named Electa Bryan, who eventually agreed to marry Plummer. By then, the group had moved here to Bannack, where Plummer's relationship with Cleveland soured over his eventual marriage with Electa Bryan. And, in true Plummer fashion, he got into an altercation with Cleveland and shot him. After the altercation, though, he wasn't arrested due to multiple witnesses confirming that it wasn't self-defense and that Cleveland had started the argument. In May of 1863, he ran for sheriff, and he won, beating out Marshal Hawk Crawford, who had actually shot Plummer in the arm in a dispute a few months prior. By June, he was married to Electa, but by August, she had made the decision to move back to Cedar Rapids, Iowa to be with family, which was considered odd by the local populace. It's about this time that things start to get a little gray historically. As the story goes, Plummer, at this point being the town sheriff, organized a group of about 100 men known as the Innocents, a gang of robbers, murderers, and thieves. The group would attack gold shipments in the area that Plummer knew the schedule of due to his position of authority. But as time went on through the summer and the fall, by October of 1863, the explosion of crime and violence led to that vigilante group being formed to deal with the gang. 2 separate events would eventually condemn Plummer himself. One was an eyewitness claim by a man named Henry Tilton, Tilton was accosted by 3 men who attempted to rob him, though he had little to give. Tilton then reported to the vigilante group that he'd recognized a distinct red-lined coat that Plummer wore regularly. On top of this was another confession by a member of the Innocents. In exchange for not being executed, he named Plummer as the ringleader. The vigilantes hung the man anyway, and then turned their attention to Plummer. On January 10, 1864, that vigilance committee found him at his sister-in-law's house, and he joined 2 of his deputies, Buck Stenson and Ned Ray. At first he assumed they wanted to ask about a man who was suspected of robbing a stagecoach earlier, but as the vigilante group forced them to the gallows, it became apparent that that wasn't the case. Deputies Stenson and Ray were hung first, fighting and swearing the whole time. Plummer was then strung up, accepting his fate, and asking for a high drop and a quick death, which the vigilante group afforded him. It was from the very gallows that he had commissioned the building of. Over those 4 to 5 months between October of 1863 and February of 1864, that vigilante group executed 23 men, all of them without trial. Coincidentally, the history of Bannack during that time between 1863 and 1864 would end up being written by members of that vigilance committee, who, for all intents and purposes, were a murderous group. And some residents claimed that the vigilantes were just as bad as the outlaws. So one would have to assume that that group is going to validate their actions by whitewashing their own deeds and potentially exaggerating the actions of the men that they personally condemned. And this is the history with which we are presented. It's not like we had any diaries or written accounts from members of the Innocents of what they were doing or whether they were acting nefariously or not. We have nothing to go off of except the word of the individuals who put those men to death. Does this mean that Henry Plummer or his deputies or any of the Innocents were actually innocent? No, not exactly. Henry Plummer had been witnessed killing at least 4 men and was known to have killed potentially 2 more. He was obviously capable of taking life and had done it several times. But at the same time, Henry Plummer had a near-decade-long record of civil service in positions like city marshal and sheriff, which, of course, would have been a fantastic cover if you're leading a gang of murderous outlaws. So I guess the truth will never really be truly known. I'd like to say a quick thank you to the Patreon members who help support me getting to these obscure spots. Thank you for watching till the end. Check out some of my other videos here. And as always, until next time, get lost.